Embark on an emotional roller coaster with Duncan as he uncovers the painful truth about his marriage. Facing betrayal, he must forge a new path for himself and his daughters. Will Duncan's journey through despair lead him to healing and a new chance at love? Join us to explore the depths of human resilience and the power of starting over. Don't miss this heart-wrenching yet uplifting story of rebuilding life from the ashes of the past. Watch now and witness a tale of transformation and hope. In the soft glow of the morning, Duncan awoke to the familiar comfort of his home, filled with the laughter of his daughters and the scent of freshly brewed coffee that Lassie always insisted on making. "Happy anniversary, love," Lassie greeted him with her customary bright smile, presenting him with a steaming cup. Her hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, just as it had the day they met. "Thank you, darling," Duncan replied, wrapping an arm around her waist and planting a kiss on her forehead. The day promised the usual tranquility of their weekends: breakfast as a family, a stroll in the nearby park, and perhaps a quiet evening with a movie once Melissa and Miranda had gone to bed. As they sat around the breakfast table, the air was filled with the usual banter. "Dad, can we go to the ice cream shop later?" Miranda asked, her eyes wide with hopeful anticipation. "Of course, Pumpkin," Duncan smiled. "How about you, Melissa? Anything special you want to do today?" "Just hanging out with you guys is special enough for me," Melissa responded, always the more reserved of the two. The day unfolded as pleasantly as it began, with laughter echoing through the house. Yet, as the sun began to set, Duncan noticed subtle changes in Lassie's demeanor. At dinner, she seemed distant, her laughter a little too forced, her glances toward her phone a little too frequent. "Is everything okay at work, Lassie? You seem a bit off today," Duncan inquired, trying to meet her gaze across the table. "Oh, it's nothing. Just the usual end-of-month craziness." Lassie brushed off his concern with a quick wave of her hand. "Don't worry about it." Later, while the girls were upstairs, Duncan found Lassie in the kitchen, her back to him, murmuring into her phone. She ended the call abruptly as he stepped closer. "Who was that?" "Just Sarah from work. She needed some reports I forgot to send her," Lassie replied, avoiding his eyes as she busied herself with cleaning up the kitchen. Duncan nodded, though the seed of doubt was already planted in his mind. He lay in bed that night, Lassie's steady breathing beside him a stark contrast to the storm of questions brewing in his head. Had he been too trusting? He remembered their vows, the promises of transparency and trust, yet now he felt the first chilling winds of doubt. As he drifted off to sleep, Duncan resolved to keep those uncomfortable questions at bay. But deep down, he knew that the tranquility of this day was fragile, perhaps as delicate as the silence that had settled between them. The storm, he feared, was just on the horizon. The morning sun cast a pale light through the curtains, finding Duncan already awake and staring blankly at the ceiling. Lassie's side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool and untouched since she had slipped out an hour earlier. Another early morning meeting, or so she had said. As the day progressed, Duncan tried to shake off his uneasy feelings, but Lassie's recent behaviors clung to him like a stubborn chill. He poured himself a coffee and sat at the kitchen table, his mind replaying the previous night's phone call and her quick dismissal. Duncan's phone buzzed with a message from his longtime friend, Mike, asking about plans for their usual Saturday golf game. Instead of the typical enthusiasm, Duncan found himself typing out a different response. "Can we meet for a beer instead? Need some advice?" "Sure thing, buddy. Everything okay?" Mike texted back. "We'll explain later," Duncan replied, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. At the pub, over a quiet booth in dim lighting, Duncan found the courage to voice his fears. "It's Lassie," he began hesitantly. "I think something's off. She's distant, always on her phone, and there are these meetings that seem to come out of nowhere." Mike listened intently, his expression serious. "Have you asked her straight up if there's something going on?" "I have, but she brushes it off. Says it's all work-related stress." Duncan sipped his beer, the bitter taste mirroring his mood. "You know, Duncan, it's probably nothing." But if it's eating you up this much, maybe keep a closer eye on things. Just to put your mind at ease, you know, Mike suggested, trying to tread lightly on his friend's raw nerves. Back at home, Duncan's resolve hardened. That evening, as they settled in the living room, Lassie once again pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping rapidly on the screen. "Who's keeping you so busy?" Duncan asked, trying to sound casual as he peered over from his book. "Just Sarah, you know how it is," Lassie answered without looking up. "Must be quite the project. You two seem to be burning the midnight oil a lot these days." Duncan prodded a little more, watching her carefully. Lassie paused, her smile a little too quick. "Yeah, it's a big one. Don't worry, it'll die down soon." She returned to her messaging, her fingers a blur. The rest of the evening passed with minimal conversation. Duncan lay in bed later, Lassie's steady breathing beside him now sounding like miles away. He turned towards her, watching the rise and fall of her shoulders, the familiar contours of her face bathed in moonlight. His heart ached with a mix of love and fear of what might be true, fear of what he might discover if he pulled at the thread of lies he suspected were weaving through their lives. As sleep eluded him, Duncan made up his mind. He would follow her to work tomorrow just to see for himself. He needed to know if it was all in his head, or if the life he thought they were building was starting to unravel. The next morning, Duncan's internal alarm woke him before the sun had even hinted at its arrival. He lay in bed, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Today he would follow Lassie to work, a thought that twisted his stomach. As Lassie prepared for work, her routine seemed normal, but each smile she threw over her shoulder struck Duncan as a potential facade. She kissed him goodbye, her lips warm, but her eyes distracted. "See you tonight," she said, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Duncan waited a tense half-hour after she left before he too headed out, driving a circuitous route that brought him to a vantage point near her office, a place where he could watch without being seen. From his car, Duncan saw Lassie enter the building. He waited, telling himself that when she didn't leave, he'd laugh about his foolishness later. But just before noon, his heart sank as he watched her exit the office with a man he'd never seen. They weren't just walking, they were laughing intimately, her hand brushing his arm. Fueled by a mix of dread and anger, Duncan followed them to a nearby cafe. Sitting 2 tables away, he watched as Lassie and the man shared a meal far too cozy for colleagues. His hands trembled, and a cold sweat gathered at his brow. Unable to bear it, Duncan confronted her as they left the cafe. "Lassie!" he called out sharply. Lassie turned, her expression shifting from surprise to guilt within a heartbeat. The man beside her looked between them, confusion etched across his features. "Duncan? What are you doing here?" Lassie stammered, her face pale. "Who is he, Lassie?" Duncan's voice was low, a controlled calm masking his turmoil. "This is just a friend, Duncan. You're misunderstanding," she replied, her voice shaking. "A friend?" Duncan scoffed, his gaze flickering to the man who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. "You don't go to lunch with just a friend like this." "Duncan, please, let's talk about this at home," Lassie pleaded, reaching out to him. Duncan stepped back, ignoring her hand. "I think I've seen enough," he said coldly, turning on his heel and walking away, the sound of Lassie calling after him fading into the background noise of the street. Back at home, Duncan sat in silence, the images of Lassie and the man replaying like a cruel loop in his mind. When Lassie returned, the door opened quietly, and he could hear her hesitant steps. "Duncan, please, let me explain," she began, her voice a mix of desperation and fear. Sitting in the dim light of the living room, Duncan looked up at her, his heart breaking. "How long, Lassie?" It just happened. It wasn't planned." "I'm so sorry," she confessed, tears starting to stream down her face. "Sorry doesn't change what you did," Duncan replied, his voice breaking. "Sorry doesn't fix us." Lassie approached him, kneeling before him and taking his hands in hers. "I love you, Duncan. I made a terrible mistake. Please, can we find a way to work through this? Duncan withdrew his hands slowly, the finality in his heart mirrored in his eyes. I don't know if I can, he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That night, the house was silent, but for the sound of broken hearts echoing off the walls, the unraveling complete and irreparable. Duncan knew that nothing would be the same again. The path ahead was uncertain, and all he could feel was the profound loss of the life he thought he knew. The morning after Duncan's discovery was a raw, chilly dawn. He and Lassie had slept in separate rooms, a silent acknowledgement of the rift that had formed between them. As he sat at the kitchen table nursing a bitter cup of coffee, the events of the previous day replayed in his mind like a torturous film loop. Lassie walked into the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her usual meticulous appearance disheveled. She hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure of her welcome. "Duncan," she started, her voice tentative. "Can we talk?" Duncan looked up, his expression unreadable. "What's left to talk about, Lassie?" His voice was cold, detached. I want to explain," Lassie replied, taking a few steps closer. "I owe you that much." Duncan sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. "Explain then. I'm listening." Lassie took a deep breath. "It started a few months ago. It was nothing at first, just casual conversations at work. But then, it became more. I never meant for it to happen, Duncan. I got lost, and I'm so sorry." "Sorry," Duncan echoed bitterly. "You're sorry. And that's supposed to be enough for me to just forgive and forget? No, I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I need you to know that I regret it every single day. I love you, Duncan. I love our family. I've made a terrible mistake." "Love," Duncan said flatly, the word laced with cynicism. "Your actions don't show love, Lassie. They show betrayal." Lassie flinched as if struck. She reached out a hand, but Duncan pulled away. I think it might be best if I stay with my sister for a while," he said, standing up from the table. "We both need some space to figure out what comes next." "Please, Duncan, don't go," Lassie pleaded, her voice breaking. "Let's try to work through this. We can see a therapist, go to counseling. Don't throw away what we have." "What we had, Lassie. What we had," Duncan corrected her sharply. "I need to clear my head. I can't look at you right now without seeing you with him. It's eating me up inside." Lassie covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Duncan's heart ached with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He packed a small bag with essentials, the weight of each item seeming to anchor him further into his new, unwelcome reality. Before he left, he went to say goodbye to his daughters. Miranda hugged him tightly, confusion and fear in her young eyes. "Why are you leaving, Daddy? Did we do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong. This is between Mommy and me. I'll be back soon, I promise," Duncan assured her, his voice thick with emotion. Melissa, more perceptive and older, looked at him with understanding. "Is it Mom?" she asked quietly. Duncan nodded, unable to speak, the truth too heavy on his tongue. He hugged her, wishing he could shield her from the adult complexities that had intruded into her world. Leaving the house was one of the hardest things Duncan had ever done. As he drove away, he felt each mile increasing the distance between him and the life he had known. He arrived at his friend Mike's house, a temporary refuge from the storm of his emotions. That night, as he lay in a strange bed, staring at the ceiling, Duncan felt a profound sense of loss. The future was uncertain, and all he knew was that the path to reconciliation, if it even existed, would be long and fraught with pain. The cold morning light filtered through the curtains at Mike's house, where Duncan had found temporary refuge. His host had been considerate, giving him space while also making sure Duncan knew he wasn't alone. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted up from the kitchen, a small but comforting gesture. Mike found Duncan in the living room, staring blankly at a muted television. "Coffee's ready. It might help," he said, setting a steaming mug on the coffee table. "Thanks," Duncan muttered, his voice hoarse from a night spent alternating between fitful sleep and long stretches of bleak wakefulness. You want to talk about it? Mike asked, sitting down across from him, his expression a blend of concern and caution. Duncan shook his head slowly, then paused. Actually, yeah. I think I do. He sighed deeply. I just can't wrap my head around it, Mike. How did I not see this coming? Was I really that blind? It's not about being blind, Mike responded gently. Sometimes we just see what we want to see. It doesn't make you foolish, Duncan. It makes you human. Duncan nodded, taking a sip of the hot coffee, feeling it warm him slightly. What do I do now, Mike? I've left the house, I've left my kids. Everything feels so broken. First things first, you need to take care of yourself, Mike advised. And then, you decide what you want for your future, your relationship, your kids, your own peace of mind, but don't rush those decisions. You're allowed to feel hurt and lost. Duncan's thoughts were interrupted by his phone vibrating. It was Elizabeth, the barista from his favorite coffee shop. Over the last few months, they had struck up a friendly acquaintance, chatting about books and music during his morning coffee runs. She had always been easy to talk to, her bright smile a comforting part of his routine. Text from Elizabeth. Hey Duncan, haven't seen you in a few days. Everything okay? Duncan hesitated before replying. Going through some tough times. Could use a friendly chat if you're up for it. Elizabeth responded quickly. Of course. Meet at the park in 30? I'm off today. Going out? Mike asked as Duncan stood up, a decision made. Yeah, a walk might do me some good, Duncan replied, a slight lift in his voice for the first time that morning. At the park, Elizabeth was already there, sitting on a bench with a takeout coffee cup beside her. She stood up as he approached, her smile warm but her eyes reflecting concern. Duncan, it's good to see you, she said, giving him a gentle hug. You look like you could use this more than me, she joked lightly, nudging the coffee toward him. Thanks, Elizabeth. And yeah, it's been rough, Duncan admitted as they sat down. They talked, really talked for the first time. Duncan shared more than he intended, drawn out by Elizabeth's genuine empathy. It sounds like you're going through a storm right now, Elizabeth observed after listening intently. But even the worst storms clear eventually, and sometimes they're necessary to wash things away. You sound like you've been through a few storms yourself, Duncan noted, looking at her with new respect. A few, Elizabeth confirmed with a wry smile. And I've learned it's not about waiting for the storm to pass, but learning to dance in the rain, even if you step in a few puddles. They spent the afternoon walking and talking, the conversation a balm to Duncan's bruised spirit. By the time they parted ways, he felt a little lighter, the burden of his troubles slightly eased by sharing them with someone outside the chaos of his immediate circle. Returning to Mike's place, Duncan felt a flicker of determination stir within him. Whatever the future held, he knew he had to face it head-on. But for now, he had found a moment of solace, a friend in Elizabeth, and a path that might just lead him through the storm. Duncan woke to the morning light streaming through the guest room window, reflecting off the wall in a soothing pattern. The previous day's walk with Elizabeth had cleared his mind, granting him a rare sense of peace amidst the turmoil. He decided it was time to take the next step, however daunting that might be. After a quiet breakfast with Mike, who had become more of a brother than a friend during these trying times, Duncan broached the topic he had been avoiding. I think I need to start the divorce proceedings, Mike, Duncan said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Mike nodded, his face serious but supportive. Are you sure you're ready for that step? It's not about being ready. It's necessary, Duncan replied with a resigned sigh. I can't go back to how things were, not after everything. All right, man, I'm here for whatever you need, Mike reassured him, clapping a comforting hand on his shoulder. Later that day, Duncan called a family lawyer, a friend of Mike's who came highly recommended. The meeting was somber and businesslike. Divorce is as much a beginning as it is an end, Duncan, the lawyer Janet advised him. It's about setting the terms for your new life. What are your main concerns? The kids, first and foremost. I want to make sure this impacts Melissa and Miranda as little as possible, Duncan stated, his tone firm. And financially? I'm not out for revenge. Let's keep it fair. I just want to move on, Duncan explained, feeling a weight lift as he laid out his intentions. With the legal wheels in motion, Duncan felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It was a final acknowledgement that his marriage was over. That afternoon, he met with Elizabeth for coffee, seeking the comfort of her company. You look like you've made some decisions, Elizabeth observed as they sat down with their drinks. I have. Started the divorce process today, Duncan replied, not meeting her eyes at first. I'm sorry, Duncan. I know that couldn't have been easy, she said softly, reaching out to gently touch his hand. It wasn't. But it feels like the right thing to do, he admitted, allowing himself a small smile. Thanks for being here, Elizabeth. These conversations, they've been a lifeline. I'm glad I could help, even if it's just listening. Elizabeth smiled back, her presence a reassuring constant in his life now. As the weeks passed, Duncan found solace in his routines, particularly the time spent with Elizabeth, who was quickly becoming more than just a friend. They shared many interests, and their conversations were a balm to his bruised heart. He also focused on being there for his daughters, explaining the situation as gently as he could. Daddy, are you and Mommy going to be happy now? Miranda asked one evening when he tucked her into bed. We're going to try, sweetheart. Mommy and Daddy both love you and your sister very much, and that's never going to change, Duncan reassured her, kissing her forehead. With each passing day, the sharp edges of Duncan's pain dulled a little, smoothed by the new relationships and routines he was building. His new beginnings were tentative, like the first shoots of spring after a harsh winter, but they were there, promising growth and, perhaps eventually, happiness. Several months had passed since Duncan initiated the divorce proceedings, and life had settled into a new kind of normalcy. The initial rawness of his emotions had given way to a steadier, if somewhat somber, acceptance. Duncan found that healing was less about forgetting and more about learning to live anew. One afternoon, Duncan picked up his daughters from school, taking them to the local park as part of their new routine. As Melissa swung higher, her laughter ringing through the air, Miranda sat next to Duncan on the bench, clutching a drawing she had made in class. Dad, do you like it? Miranda asked, holding up the colorful picture of a house with 4 smiling figures in front. It's beautiful, Miranda. Is that us? Duncan asked, smiling despite the pang in his heart for the simplicity of her world. Yes, and look, that's Elizabeth. I made her hair red because I remember she likes that color, Miranda explained earnestly. Duncan chuckled softly. That's very thoughtful of you, sweetheart. The inclusion of Elizabeth in Miranda's drawing, a sign of acceptance, warmed him more than he expected. Later that day, Duncan met Elizabeth for coffee, a tradition that had become their cherished routine. As they sat in their usual spot at the cafe, Duncan shared Miranda's drawing. She included you in our family drawing, Duncan said, his voice tinged with emotion as he handed the picture to Elizabeth. Elizabeth took the drawing, her eyes softening. That's really sweet of her. I'm honored to be part of your lives, Duncan, even if it's just a small part. You're more than just a small part, Elizabeth. You've been incredible through all of this, Duncan admitted, feeling a deep gratitude for her presence in his life. Their conversation drifted to plans for the future. So, what's next for us? Elizabeth asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Duncan took a deep breath, the question sparking a mixture of hope and anxiety. I've been thinking about that. I want to make sure the girls are stable and happy. And for us, he paused, searching her eyes. I want to explore where this can go. Slowly, respectfully, but honestly. Elizabeth reached across the table, her hand covering his. That's all I could ask for, she said, a smile spreading across her face. As the weeks turned into months, Duncan worked diligently with his lawyer to finalize the divorce. It was an amicable process, Lassie and he agreeing on most terms without animosity. They both attended counseling sessions to navigate their co-parenting, ensuring they provided a united front for Melissa and Miranda. One evening, as the divorce was nearing its final stages, Duncan sat down with the girls to explain what would happen next. "Daddy and Mommy are going to be living in different houses, but we both love you very much. We'll always be a family, just a little different," Duncan explained gently. "Will you still come to my soccer games?" Melissa asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Every game I can," Duncan promised, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "And you'll still do movie nights?" Miranda chimed in, seeking her own reassurance. "Every Friday night. It's our tradition," Duncan affirmed, offering them both a smile that was both sad and hopeful. As the final papers were signed, Duncan felt a sense of closure. He was free to move forward, to heal fully. He and Elizabeth began to spend more time together, integrating her more prominently into his and his daughter's lives. The healing process was slow, sometimes painful, but Duncan found solace in the hope for a happier future. The chapter of his life with Lassie had closed, but as he looked to the horizon, the dawn of a new chapter with Elizabeth and his daughters filled him with anticipation. It was not the life Duncan had envisioned years ago, but it was a life filled with potential and love. The finalization of Duncan's divorce marked the end of a turbulent chapter in his life. As he turned the page, the new chapter that began was filled with cautious optimism and the nurturing of new beginnings with Elizabeth and his daughters. One sunny Saturday morning, Duncan and Elizabeth planned a special outing with Melissa and Miranda to the local botanical garden, a place teeming with life and new growth, a fitting symbol for their emerging family dynamic. As they walked along the winding paths lined with vibrant blooms, Duncan watched Miranda skip ahead, her laughter mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. "Dad, look! The roses are blooming!" Miranda called out, pointing excitedly towards a sprawling rose bush adorned with flowers. "They're beautiful, aren't they? Just like the drawing you made," Duncan replied, catching up to her and crouching to her level. Melissa, who was walking alongside Elizabeth, seemed more contemplative. "Elizabeth, do you like gardening?" she asked, glancing up at her with curiosity. "I do." Elizabeth smiled down at her. "There's something magical about planting something and watching it grow, don't you think?" "Yeah, it's like what's happening with us," Melissa said thoughtfully, a mature insight for her age, which made both Duncan and Elizabeth exchange a warm, knowing look. Lunchtime found them seated at a picnic area, sharing sandwiches and laughter, the lightness of their spirits a stark contrast to the heavy days that had preceded this season. "Elizabeth, will you be around for my birthday party next month? Can you help us with the decorations?" Miranda asked, her eyes hopeful as she took a bite of her sandwich. Elizabeth glanced at Duncan, seeking confirmation, and upon seeing his nod, she replied, "I'd love to, Miranda. We'll make it the best birthday yet." As the day wound down, the four of them sat on a bench overlooking a serene pond, the water reflecting the clear blue sky. "Dad, I think we're like those ducks," Miranda said, pointing to a family of ducks gliding across the pond. "Even though they go different ways sometimes, they always come back together." "That's very true, sweetheart," Duncan said, feeling a swell of pride and love for his insightful daughter. Later that evening, after dropping the girls back home, Duncan and Elizabeth found themselves walking along a quiet path in the park, the day's joy mingling with a sense of deep contentment. "Duncan, today was wonderful," Elizabeth said, her hand finding his as they walked. "Seeing you with the girls, how they're accepting this new life, it's beautiful." "It is," Duncan agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "You've brought so much light into our lives, Elizabeth. I'm not sure how to thank you. Just being with you, seeing you happy, that's all the thanks I need," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft. As they stopped to watch the sunset, Duncan felt the final remnants of his old fears and hurts slip away. Turning to Elizabeth, he knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with love and laughter. Elizabeth, I'm not sure what the future holds, but I'm sure about one thing. I want you to be part of it, Duncan said earnestly. And I will be, Elizabeth replied, her voice firm and reassuring. As long as you'll have me. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a brilliant canvas marking the end of a day and the promise of tomorrow. In this moment, Duncan realized that healing was not just about moving past pain, but also embracing the joy that followed. This new chapter, filled with hope and new beginnings, was just starting, and Duncan was ready to make the most of every page. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed this video and want to stay up to date with our latest content, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You definitely won't want to miss what's coming up next. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with sweet cheating stories.